Welcome to the Doc C. Bracey Center for Human Reconciliation.
Good evening, and welcome to the Doc C. Bracey Center for Human Reconciliation webinar series. My name is Paul Bracey, and I am the president and founder of the center. This evening's presentation by Judy Farnam is focused on the white power movement, its history, threat, and what we can do about it. Before I introduce Ms. Farnam, a few comments. Joining me in this is our Chief Operating Officer, Randy Wilding, who is coming to us from Florida. The center is a 501c3 nonprofit. Our leadership team are all volunteers. Our programs are free, and we are funded by individual donations from people like you. You can say that our donations are given back to you through our programs, such as this webinar. Please consider making donations so we can continue to offer our services free. Thank you. The threat to our democracy is real. Our country is divided on lies, half-truths, and conspiracy theories. The rise of the white power movement under the guise of a political party is real, and the use of violence is real. Project 2025 is a blueprint to destroy our democracy and create an autocracy, a system of government by one person with absolute power. For me and you, this presidential election is the most important in our lifetime. We need to understand the threat. We need to understand what we can do tonight. And we need to recognize that even after the election, we will still have this issue. Tonight's presentation will shed light on the threat. Our October 16th webinar will focus more directly on what we can do. If you haven't already registered for this coming webinar, we invite you to do so. Julie Farnam is the author of The Domestic Darkness, an insider's account of the January 6th insurrection and the future of the right-wing extremism. Ms. Farnam served as the assistant and then acting director of intelligence for the United States Capitol Police during one of the most tumultuous periods in this country's history. During her time there, she oversaw the identification and vetting of nearly 20,000 threats against members of Congress, many of which were made by U.S. citizens who adhered to an extremist ideology. Prior to joining the Capitol Police, Ms. Farnam served with the Department of Homeland Security for over 15 years. We are honored to have Judy with us this evening and an opportunity for her to share her insights into the white power movement in our country with firsthand knowledge of the events and actors involved in January 6, 2021, an insurrection that almost destroyed our democracy. Please join me in welcoming Julie Farnam. Good evening, Julie.
Good evening. Thank you for having me. So thank you so much for that nice introduction. So my name is Julie Farnam, and I worked for a little over 15 years in the Department of Homeland Security doing immigration and intelligence work. And then in October of 2020, I went over to the Capitol Police. So my timing was great. I went right before the presidential election, and I had been on the job for 72 days when January 6th happened. And I was there at the Capitol Police as the Assistant Director of Intelligence, but then I ended up serving as Director of Intelligence for a little over a year during my time there. So I'm excited to talk about this important topic. It's a heavy topic, I know, but it is an important topic, and I'm happy to be here and share my knowledge with all of you. So let's see if we can advance here. All right. So for today's agenda, we are going to talk about, I'm not going to go back real far in American history. I'm going to start the talk with the rise of the KKK in the 1920s, which is one of the more notable and recognizable white supremacist groups in the US. I'm going to touch upon some of the events in the United States that have had a strong influence on today's extremist groups. We'll look at some of the more recent tactics and trends of these groups, particularly post-January 6th, because they did change after January 6th. We will talk about why people join hate groups and how hate harms our democracy. And then finally, we will look to the future. So white supremacy and terrorism. And terrorism is the deliberate use or threat of violence by a non-state actor, so by a non-government, to achieve political goals and to create a broad psychological impact. And then domestic terrorism, it is defined under Title 18 U.S. Code Section 2331, not to get too technical here, but I think this is important to understand what domestic terrorism is, because we're going to be talking about it all night. And that's defined as acts dangerous to human life that occur primarily within U.S. territory and are intended to intimidate or coerce a civilian population, to influence a policy of a government by intimidation or coercion, or to affect the conduct of a government by mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping. So according to the Southern Poverty Law Center, in 2023, which is the most recent data that they have, there were 165 active white nationalist groups in the United States. And that is the highest number that they've ever recorded. And there's, I think, a few reasons for that, which we will get into as we go through this presentation. And we'll also talk about a few of the more active or notable or interesting groups in a couple different slides. So before we get going here, I want to make sure we all have an understanding of some of the terms that I'm going to be using just to level set everyone. So homegrown and domestic terrorism, they're actually two different things. A homegrown terrorist is someone who adheres to a foreign terrorist organization's ideology, but they're here in the United States. So that would be someone, conducting an attack here in the US based on Al-Qaeda's ideology. Domestic terrorism is someone here who adheres to an ideology that has originated here in the United States. And then REMVE, or REMVE, that stands for racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists. So you'll hear that quite a bit when in this world. So a lot of people call it REMVE for short. And then accelerationists, those are some white supremacist groups are accelerationist, and as the name suggests, they want to accelerate the collapse of society so they can rebuild in the image they want, namely a white society. So that collapse could be a civil war, and some groups do advocate for starting a civil war, but it could also be some sort of triggering violent event. And then finally is the Great Replacement, and we hear this a lot. There was just a tweet today from a political figure who talked about immigrants trying to replace us. So the Great Replacement is a concept that has existed for a very long time, but that term Great Replacement was coined in 2011 by a French author, Renaud Camus. And my French is really bad, so apologies. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. But the Great Replacement concept believes that white people are going to be replaced by immigrants or by diluting, quote unquote, pure blood. And pure blood, of course, in this context is considered Western European Christian descent white blood. And it was notably referenced, this concept of a Great Replacement. It was referenced extensively in the manifestos for the Christchurch mosque shooter, Brenton Tarrant. In fact, he entitled his manifesto, The Great Replacement. And then Peyton Gendron, who is the Buffalo supermarket shooter, he also referenced the Great Replacement quite a bit in his manifesto. All right, so let's read this quote. Actually, my thing is covering the quote. Let me move that down there. All right, so this is a very famous quote from German theologian Martin Niemöller. And so it says, first they came for the socialist, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. So a very powerful, very well-known quote. It was written in 1946. And this person who wrote it, he originally supported the Nazis, and by his own accounts, he was anti-Semitic. But then he opposed what the Nazis were doing with the Protestant church, and they arrested him and they put him in a concentration camp. He survived, and in 1946, he became someone who spoke out for the things that he saw in those concentration camps and the things that were happening to the Jewish population under the Nazi regime. And okay. So before we get into this, I think it's important to talk about like why this is important and why we should care about it. So I'm actually going to start with the purple box because it segues nicely from the previous slide. That hate never solves any problems. And just like we saw in the previous slide, hate will eventually find you if it goes unchecked. So we've seen hate spread. It was the Jews, it was the Blacks, and more now we're seeing women being targeted. And I'm not talking about general discrimination. I'm talking about extremists like incels, like the Proud Boys. We see immigrants being targeted, like we just spoke about at the Great Replacement. We see the LGBTQ plus community being the main target of many of the groups that we'll be discussing tonight. So the hate does spread. And fundamentally, everyone deserves to feel safe. And when hate is allowed to exist in a community, community members cannot feel safe. They can't self-actualize. They can't be who they are because their very existence is threatened. And it's threatened because often radicalization can lead to violence. We saw this with the El Paso Walmart shooting. We saw this with the Buffalo supermarket shooting. We saw it with the Pittsburgh Tree of Life shooting, and on and on and on the list goes. And then I'll just mention too, communities where everyone has a voice makes for a better community. You have different ideas and perspectives for solving problems. Community members feel valued and they feel like they belong. And belonging and purpose, as we'll talk about later, is also something that helps guard people against joining these extremist groups. Yeah, sorry. Okay. So let's start by talking about the KKK, which is one of the better known and one of the older groups here in the United States. So as we explore the white power movement in the United States, I'm going to start in the 1920s with the Ku Klux Klan. So in the 1920s, the KKK was not some secretive group with their pointy white hats in the backwoods of the South. No, they were very prominent and mainstream, and they numbered about 5 million members in the 1920s. And at that time, they were used for enforcers of prohibition. And they didn't necessarily object to alcohol or the consumption of alcohol. In fact, they would often consume alcohol that they stole from whoever. But prohibition was really the means for them to target minority populations. And in particular, in the 1920s, they targeted Catholics and Italians. They really didn't target African Americans until the 1960s, or they're more known to target African Americans in the 1960s. And part of that is because that's our more recent history and people remember that more than the 1920s. So Catholics, like I said, and especially Italians, were the primary target of the KKK's hatred in the 1920s. They felt that these minority groups and immigrants were a threat to American culture and society, not dissimilar to what you see today with these racially and ethnically motivated extremist groups. They were talking about the Great Replacement in the 1920s, even if they didn't necessarily call it the Great Replacement. So the KKK at the time was large, they were organized, and they were very politically motivated. In the 1920s, they were able to back coordinated efforts to get certain individuals elected into public office. So Governor Len Small of Illinois was reelected in 1924 with the assistance of the KKK. Hugo Black, who was a former senator and he eventually became a Supreme Court justice, was another person. And once,
I'm going to need you to.
can I see? can we mute? Let me see. Sorry. Okay. But Hugo Black, once he got on the Supreme Court, he backed the continuance of the Japanese internment. So that was not exactly, you know, a bright spot in American history. And he had been a member of the KKK. Indiana counted many elected officials as KKK members and adherents, including its governor from 1925 to 1929, Edward Jackson. And then in Colorado, you had Governor Clarence Morley, who was very close to the KKK and regularly consulted with its members in pushing forward state legislative agendas. And it wasn't until there was an alliance between Republicans and Democrats to block the bills and the legislation that he was trying to push he was ineffective as a politician at that point, and he was not reelected. But it took both parties coming together to oppose him. And so today we see a similar situation, politically anyways. With the KKK, it's not as large today as it was once upon a time, particularly in the 20s and the 60s. But they do still exist. They have about 5,000 members now, rather than the 5 million at their height in the 1920s. But they're still influential in today because their ideology is shared by other active extremist groups operating here in this country. And they also have that name recognition. Everyone knows who the KKK is. So let's talk about some of the groups that we have today. I'm going to start with Patriot Front. So Patriot Front was started in 2017 by a guy named Thomas Ryan Rousseau. And Rousseau, he is very active on social media. He is not like one of those white supremacists who like cover their face and try to hide who they are. Like he's out there in the open, and he's pretty politically and media savvy. But Patriot Front, don't be fooled, is quite extreme. They are a white supremacist, neo-fascist, American nationalist group. So they tie their ideology to nationalism. They do these marches, and their marches are very like scripted and choreographed. So they arrive to their marches in a moving truck, like a U-Haul truck. And they have shields, they have face masks, they have khaki pants, they light flares during their march. And they've marched on Capitol Hill many times, including when I was there. So I saw their marches in person. They often chant things like "Reclaim America" when they're marching. And their members have faced vandalism and weapons charges. They've also collaborated with international white supremacist groups, including the Nordic Resistance Movement of Sweden and Casa Pound, which is located in Rome, Italy. And Patriot Front is very, very into propaganda. And there are some other white supremacist groups that we'll talk about that don't necessarily take Patriot Front as seriously as other groups, because they think they're too much like fluff and show and like propaganda and polished videos and pictures and things like that. And they don't take the ideology seriously. But because they are so showy, they attract a lot of attention, and that's a way of promoting their ideology. So next we have NSC 131. They were present on January 6th. There are quite a few members there. NSC stands for National Socialist Club, and 131 is based on the letters ACA, so like the first and third letter of the alphabet, and ACA stands for Anti-Communist Action. But this group was founded in New England, not too far from where I grew up, to be honest. It was founded by Christopher Hood in 2019. The group has grown steadily since its creation, and it's branched out of New England now and has expanded into Florida, Kentucky, Texas, Virginia, Indiana, and Arizona. And they are considered accelerationists. So they want to see a collapse of society to rebuild it as a white society. Next, we have Blood Tribe. Blood Tribe is also a relatively new white supremacist group, and it is also rapidly growing. They had their first public demonstration in March of 2023, so pretty recently, about a year and a half ago. They had a demonstration at a drag show in Ohio. They often target the LGBTQ plus community, but they are also staunchly racist and anti-Semitic. They have chapters in the United States and in Canada. They were founded by a guy named Christopher Pohlhaus, and he's known on social media as Hammer. He started this group in Texas in 2020. So like I said, it's relatively new. Hammer, this guy, Christopher Pohlhaus, he's a former Marine. And you'll see a lot of these groups have former military or law enforcement in them. And this group started with just an online presence on social media. And Hammer got a lot of followers, and he called his followers his blood tribe. So that's where the name of the group comes from. But they are a hardcore white supremacist group, and they don't like other white supremacist groups like Patriot Front that take a softer stance. And because they're hardcore, members of Blood Tribe tend to be already involved in this movement, in this ideology. This is not for baby white supremacists. These are hardened people who truly believe in this ideology. They're not dipping their toe in it. They're fully immersed. This group is also, they're hypermasculine too. I forgot to mention that. They have no female members. Girls are not allowed in Blood Tribe. And a lot of these groups have very specific ideas on gender roles. And it's usually very hypermasculine male and the subservient female and the family unit. That's a big thing in a lot of these groups. But Blood Tribe also has what's called an Odinist slant. In Odinism, it's a white supremacy variant of modern Norse paganism that worships the mythical Norse god Odin, also known as Wotan. And that is the god of war and death. And so a lot of white supremacist groups, not just Blood Tribe, they've really hijacked this Norse mythology. And that first started with the Nazis in the 1930s. And there was this belief that ancient Norse culture was preserved in Iceland, and it was the pure Germanic culture. And the values were forcibly erased elsewhere, largely because of different religions. And these white supremacist groups and the Nazis were drawn to these stories about necessary war in Norse mythology. And a lot of groups, and let me flip the slide here, they'll use this black sun. So the black image on the left side of your screen is a Sonnenrad, also known as a black sun. And that was created by the Nazis. And a lot of time you'll see that symbol with a swastika in the middle. And the Nazis, erroneously attributed it to the Norse, but it was their interpretation of the Merovingian disc, which is the disc that's on the right-hand side, which I'm probably pronouncing wrong, so I apologize for that. And so there's this school of thought that Norse imagery was adopted by modern neo-Nazi and white supremacist groups, so they wouldn't overtly raise concerns that they were a hate group. So if you saw this, if you were in the know, you were in the know, wink, wink, we're white supremacists, but the general population wouldn't necessarily know that unless they were enmeshed in that world. So that's how it came about. But you saw a lot of references to Norse mythology and the Black Sun, like Peyton Gendron, which I talk about him a lot tonight because I think he did something very, very awful in the name of white supremacy, but also he has a very unique manifesto that was sort of a guidebook on how to commit violence. But anyways, Peyton Gendron, the Buffalo shooter, he has a Sonnenrad right on the front of his manifesto. And you see Norse imagery in hate groups now, and has been referenced by a lot of violent extremists. Like we just mentioned, Gendron, Andres Breivik, who was the Norway shooter who shot up the summer camp and killed many, many people. Brenton Tarrant, who's the Christchurch mosque shooter, and then Jacob Chansley, who was the January 6th QAnon shaman. He had tattoos with Norse imagery, which suggests that he affiliated with some sort of white supremacist ideology. And then the last group on this slide, we have active clubs. Active clubs are also relatively new. They started in maybe like 2022. And in 2022, there were 12 chapters. And in 2023, they jumped all the way to 39 chapters, and they continue to grow. So active clubs, they were created by this guy named Robert Rundo. And if you follow like the white supremacy movement, you will know who this guy is. He was the founder of the Rise Above movement, which was a violent white supremacist group that was originally based out of Southern California. And they largely disbanded. Rise Above movement, or RAM, largely disbanded after the 4 members were arrested related to the Unite the Right rally in 2017 in Charlottesville. But these active clubs, so the new group that Robert Rundo has created, they're heavily focused on training to fight. They're modeled after these European mixed martial arts white supremacist groups, and they really focus on encouraging men to create their own small active clubs. They sometimes have small marches, but mostly they gather privately to train, to fight, to do things like, burn books. So they're more, they're small, but they're growing. All right, and then these 4 groups I want to highlight for a couple different reasons, because they're a little bit unique. Actually, one of them is not a group at all, but we'll get into that. So the first one I'm going to talk about is Asatru Folk Assembly. So it was founded in 1995 by Stephen McAllen, and it was really, he resurrected this group from the 1970s called the Asatru Free Assembly, which was originally known as the Viking Brotherhood. He's this guy, Stephen McNallen, also is the one who coined the term Odinism that we just talked about. And he coined this term in this newsletter that he used to publish from like the late 1970s to the early 80s. And his newsletter was called Runestone. And you'll hear references to, if you ever look up Asatru Folk Assembly, they have a lot of references to that word Runestone too. Of note with Runestone, a couple of the editions in 1981 and 1982 contained ads for the Turner Diary, which we're going to talk about in the next slide, but just make note of that. But so the name for this group, Asatru Folk Assembly, it comes from the Viking religion Asatru. And that is a religion, it's a real religion. It is practiced today in Iceland. Unfortunately, that religion has been, or the name of that religion has been hijacked by this like pretty awful group, because the true Asatru religion that's practiced today in Iceland, their pillars are harmony with nature, honesty, tolerance, like the complete opposite of what Asatru Folk Assembly is. Asatru Folk Assembly, they believe that the white race is dying and it must be preserved. And what's unique about this group and why I'm highlighting it here is that it is a 501c3 organization. So it's tax-exempt religious organization. They have formal paid membership. They also do fundraisers. And with the money they gather, which I think is also unique to them, is that they've used it to purchase property because they want to create communities, like white communities. And they're going about it very deliberately. So in August 2015, they bought a hall in Brownsville, California. In June 2020, they bought a former church in Murdoch, Minnesota. And the people in Minnesota did try to push back on it and block the sale. But legally, there was nothing they could do to not allow the sale to go through. But it's good to know that, there were people in the community who let them know that they were not welcomed. And then they also bought a former church in April of 2020 in Linden, North Carolina. Now, Linden, North Carolina is a very tiny place. There's only about a population of 130. but about a quarter of those people are African American. So can you imagine like having this white supremacist group come in, buy a church in your little community, and they hate Black people? So going back to that slide before, I think it was slide 6, where we talk about like needing to feel safe, and everyone should feel safe in their own communities. Like, how safe do those people feel if this group is coming into their community? So it's pretty awful. This group also has a very heavy focus on recruiting military and law enforcement, as do other groups. Next is the base. The base is a white supremacist neo-Nazi accelerationist group. They were founded by Ronaldo Nazzaro in 2018. They are not necessarily focused on building their membership, or they weren't when they're kind of defunct now, which I'll talk about why they're defunct in a second. But they really want individuals to become revolutionaries, and they want to inspire lone wolves to act. And that, I think, is really, really dangerous, because I do think the biggest threat we have now are those like lone wolf actors. They openly advocate for violence, and they believe a race war is imminent. And I mentioned the base here for 2 reasons. One is because law enforcement had some success in dismantling them. They infiltrated the group, as did some of the journalists. And there were a lot of arrests made of group members, and they were arrested for things like conspiracy to commit murder, weapons charges, vandalism, conspiring against the rights of minorities, and other charges as well. And they eventually got the reputation of being a honeypot. So like, join here and you're going to get arrested or entrapped or whatever it may be. So Nazzaro fled to Russia, which is where he resides now, or is believed to reside now. I also mention this because Nazzaro is from Arlington, Virginia, which is where I am sitting right now. And Arlington, Virginia, if you don't know, is a very liberal place. And I think there is sometimes this perception that if the area that you live in is like more liberal or more left-leaning, that these things don't happen here. Like, this guy is from Arlington, Virginia. Also note that in Arlington, Virginia, the American Nazi Party's headquarters were in Arlington, Virginia in the 1960s and 70s. And then it got blown up and the leader got murdered. But, and it's a nice coffee shop now, but they were originally located here in Virginia, in Arlington, Virginia. And so you have to be vigilant against racism and hate no matter where you are. Okay, so next we have White Lives Matter. White Lives Matter is not a group. It is just a propaganda arm for white supremacists. They do these stickering campaigns. They are active in every state, and they have a strong social media presence. So they're not a group, they're just propaganda, but many white supremacist groups borrows from this propaganda and uses their propaganda. And then last, I'll talk about the Proud Boys. The Proud Boys is generally not a white supremacist group. And before January 6th, because I think most of you know that Proud Boys was heavily involved with January 6th. Before January 6th, the Proud Boys had a very hierarchical national structure. So you had Enrique Tarrio at the top. He was the leader, and he gave the commands to all the like lower level chapters and lower level groups. But after January 6th, and Enrique Tarrio got the longest prison sentence of anyone involved in January 6th. He got a 22-year sentence. But after January 6th, like, the group split. And so they're more just like localized, locally managed and organized chapters. And they've exploded since January 6th. There's 154 chapters now. 18 of those chapters are international chapters. And what we're seeing is that some of these chapters are more of a white supremacist, neo-Nazi type ideology. Proud Boys, generally speaking, for those of you who don't know, they consider themselves Western chauvinist. So they're very misogynistic. They fight a lot. They're very into like male supremacy, things like that, but they weren't necessarily racially motivated. But we're seeing that change a little bit more. So some of the chapters, particularly like their New York, New Jersey, Texas chapters, are quite racist. And when I was at the Capitol Police, I had an agent who worked for me go interview Enrique Tarrio in a prison about something we had a question about. And Enrique Tarrio loves to talk. He loves to talk. And what he was saying is that he was worried that the group was becoming more racially motivated as well. And I think he is right about that. And so what we're seeing now is that Proud Boys are starting to be like the feeder group for some of these more extreme white supremacist groups. And like Christopher Hood, the leader of NSC 131, also counts himself as a Proud Boy. So we're seeing some Proud Boys transitioning from that male superiority complex ideology to more white supremacist and racially motivated. So let's talk about some of the influences. So the Turner Diaries, like the influence of this book on white supremacists and neo-Nazis cannot be understated or overstated. It's very, very influential. So the book was first published in 1978, and it continues to this day to be a huge inspiration for white supremacists. The book tells a story of a government controlled by Jews who confiscate citizens' firearms and who condemn racists. The main character of the book leads a group known as the Organization in the book, and they bring about a revolution against the government. And in the book, the main character uses a truck bomb to blow up an FBI building. So if this storyline sounds familiar, it's because it served as the blueprint for Timothy McVeigh, who, of course, was responsible for the Oklahoma City bombing. And actually, the New York Times, a week after the Oklahoma City bombing, they wrote a story about the Turner Diaries, and they made that connection between the storyline and the Turner Diaries and Timothy McVeigh. And that was before he had been arrested. And when he was arrested, in his car, he had actual pages of the Turner Diary in his car. And then, 25 years later, the New York Times is again writing about the Turner Diaries in 2021. And this time they were talking about it in relation to the Capitol insurrection on January 6th. The next book, it's a book, but it's really a collection of essays. I would argue that it's not so much the book that is the influence, but rather the person who wrote the book, James Mason. So James Mason is an active neo-Nazi, and he has been since he was 14. He joined the youth group of the American Nazi Party in 1966. He joined the National Socialist Liberation Front in 1976, and that group advocated armed revolution to overthrow the system and establish a neo-Nazi government. James Mason was very close to Charles Manson, like the serial killer Charles Manson, and worked with him when Manson was still in prison and alive. And then from 1980 to 1986, Mason published these essays, which he called Siege. And it is strongly accelerationist ideology. They believe that, acts of murder and other violence would help create enough social chaos to destabilize the system. It's highly influential to certain groups, like Atomwaffen Division used to have all their members read Siege. So Siege has 227 essays, and it was first published as a book in 1993, and it quickly became a neo-Nazi white supremacist cult classic. I'll read a little excerpt of it, just so you know, because I think this excerpt kind of captures like what the whole book is about. And I will save you from having to read 227 poorly written essays. All right, so here's the quote. It is an unnatural, peculiarly human trait that allows so many otherwise intelligent people of our race to look upon inferiors as equals. It is something, a sickness actually, that will most certainly die with the passing of this current age and hopefully will not take all the rest of us down with it. In line with the priority of the blood kept pure and free of alien genes, When comparing the respective damage to be done by other forms of pollutants, I've also stated that the condition and content of these cities makes a positively attractive case for atomic warfare. So in that, you've got like your great replacement theory, you've got your pure blood concept, you've got the use of violence, like it's all wrapped up into one. And that's Siege in a nutshell. But I think the bigger challenge is dismantling these proxy leaders. So leaders of an ideology who inspire and mentor, like James Mason, but who themselves are not necessarily a leader of any specific groups. So for example, James Mason, his influence can't be discounted. He draws inspiration from Hitler and Nazi Germany. He draws inspiration from Charles Manson. He meets and advises and motivates new generations of neo-Nazis. He's very much a leader in this ideological space, and disrupting his sway would be beneficial, but making him lose his relevance is more difficult than simply removing a leader from power. And dismantling influence, I would argue today, is even harder because of the internet and because of social media. So these two books, books like Mein Kampf, like they're very, very easy to find on the internet, and they're available to find for free. You can download the whole books. It took me, about 30 seconds to find these books. So they're out there, and their influence is still strong today. So let's talk about some of the tactics and trends we are seeing today with some of these groups. Particularly after January 6th, we saw some white supremacist groups kind of change the way they portrayed themselves. And groups like Patriot Front, Atsu Folk Assembly, NSC 131, they engaged in these activities intended to improve their communities, like shoveling snow in the picture there, but removing graffiti from murals, holding food drives, handing out care packages to the homeless, cleaning up litter. And then by engaging in these legitimate activities of service, they endear themselves to the community. And maybe that makes them come across as like, well, they're not so dangerous. They're not so problematic, but they are very dangerous. Because when you dig further into like their social media accounts, for example, participants and supporters use their social media profiles to display swastikas, sundials, posting things like, and this is a quote from one of the, I believe it was NSC 131. They said, "Our people are racially aware. They just need some encouragement. There's nothing to stop you, only the 14. And the 14, of course, is a reference to 14 words, which is like the motto of a lot of white supremacist groups. And the 14 words are, we must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children. So you'll see a lot of like neo-Nazis and white supremacists with the numbers 14 tattooed on their body. And that's what it's referencing. So some of these groups may have changed tactics, but their hate still very much exists, even if it isn't overtly at the surface anymore. Then we also see this shift to like small decentralized groups. So there's less focus on more hierarchical structures. The focus is shifting to smaller localized groups and chapters. And we've seen this with, the dawn of active clubs. We saw it with the Proud Boys. We've seen it with Blood Tribe. And I'd argue that this makes them even more dangerous because members are recruiting from their own network, and they're recruiting largely like in person. And that potentially makes them more impactful and influential within their communities. And then finally, political activism. Particularly in the past couple of years or so, we've seen people who adhere to racist ideologies. Sorry, my cat is like, wants to jump up here, sorry. And seeing these people who adhere to these racist ideologies trying to get elected to local government, especially school boards. Some of that is driven by fear of a curriculum that teaches about racism and a historical dismissal of teaching students about different perspectives on our history. But it also has to do with efforts to provide LGBTQ community members protections and inclusion. But for all of these things, when it comes to you and what you can do, and we'll talk more about it at the end too, first and foremost, you can call out what you're seeing. And I think that's more important than anything. Like, use your voice, because you do have a voice. Educate your neighbors. I just did a book talk in Massachusetts not too long ago, and I talked about NSC 131, and I did the presentation just outside of Boston. I was like, and NSC 131 started in the town next door. And I told them like some of the symbols they'd see and some of the things like that. And then a couple weeks later, someone called me and was like, I saw these. And so like just raising that awareness, because it's always been there in their community, but they just didn't know what they were seeing. And once they knew, like, then you can do something about it. And then some people just don't know what's happening in their community, so educate them. I'd also encourage you to run for office. We'll talk more about that later too, but we need good people in office and reasonable people who think logically and aren't hateful. Okay, so why do people join hate groups? I'm going to start with a quote from Oprah. Oprah's going to impart her knowledge here. So Oprah said, you cannot hate other people without hating yourself. And I think she is right about that. Because a lot of the reasons why people join these groups is because they have that desire for social status. They have that need for wanting to belong. But it always starts with a grievance, which we'll talk about more in the next slide. But joining these groups provides opportunity to do something about that grievance. And so many people who harbor extremist beliefs do not join extremist groups, nor do they commit violent acts. Belief alone is not enough to propel someone to terrorism, domestic or foreign. The motivating factors for joining a white supremacist group, a foreign terrorist group, a gang, they're all very similar. Multiple studies have shown that group membership can satisfy basic needs, such as the need to feel valued and to be respected by others, like real basic stuff. And it provides camaraderie and purpose. And that's what these people are missing in their lives. So the road to radicalization. So there are a few different models out there regarding the pathway to radicalization and violence. This is one that I have on the screen. Another one that I talk about in my book is called The Pathway to Violence, and it was developed by Frederick Calhoun and Steve Weston in the early 2000s. But they all kind of start with the same basic principle. What motivates someone to become interested in extremist ideology, regardless of what that ideology is, it could be racially motivated, it could be animal rights activists, things like that. It comes down to a grievance. And that grievance doesn't need to be some major national concern. It can be quite small and personal. And those who radicalize have this hole in their lives that they need to fill. And whether the driving force is disillusionment, a personal crisis, or moral disgust, personal voids propel them to find interest and comfort in ideologies of the violent and extreme. And we're going to put in the chat a link to a CNN article, not so much the article, but the video that goes with the article. It talks about an individual who was arrested and convicted of making threats to, I believe it was a politician. And his son talks about how he became radicalized. And I think, listen to the son speaking about how his dad got more and more extreme, because it's kind of like textbook radicalization. I think it's a really good example of someone becoming radicalized. But in the next stage, the person seeks out, or in some cases, extremists find them, especially online. They find other people who share the same grievances. And like I said, this often happens online. Extremist groups, particularly some white supremacist groups, market themselves with these polished videos, pictures, choreographed marches, like we talked about with the Patriot Front. Even if you go back, can I go back here? Like, look at these pictures. These pictures are from active clubs. Like, these are these like buff, like fit, young, active men. Like, people will see that. Young men will see that and be like, I want that. I want to be that. So they have these, these polished videos, choreographed marches, and they're deliberately crafted for maximum appeal to their target audience. And in our case, for purposes of this discussion, the target audience is young white men. Many of these groups sell an image and they sell an ideal. And these are tools in the repertoire to grow their organizations. And we've seen other organizations and other extremist groups use this. So Al-Qaeda was really good at this practice, and they used it extensively with a whole lot of success. They would have slick publications written in the language of their target audiences. They post videos that were intended to inspire. But whether it's Al-Qaeda or Patriot Front, this propaganda is published with the intent of piquing interest. And then the next step in this pathway to radicalization is that the ideology becomes hardened in the individual. The ideology becomes part of their regular way of thinking. And this normalization is a step to making extremism acceptable, and it makes it more palatable to a vulnerable person who maybe isn't looking to become violent, but is upset with the way he feels, in this situation, whites are being treated, or the power he feels Jews possess. And then by gaining commitments incrementally, the individual is slowly brought into the fold. And with each progressive commitment, the person moves one step closer to radicalization and violence. So this is another technique that was really perfected with Al-Qaeda. So you can't go to someone and say, hey, do you want to be a suicide bomber like on day one? They're not going to agree to that. But if it's like a little bit and then a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more, then like before you know it, they're like thinking about and plotting violence. So it's very incremental. I will say too, particularly here in the United States with a lot of these extremist groups, they'll do something called gore posting, which is, as the name suggests, posting like really violent videos, things like that. And that's intended to desensitize the person. So as they progress along this pathway to becoming violent and radicalizing and becoming violent, it's less of a jump for them to do something violent because they won't be shocked by the violence because they've seen it already. So then the person becomes more immersed in a radical world, and they surround themselves with people who think similarly. They detach from those people or things that don't fit this new worldview that they have. And then it moves to violent ideation. And this, in my opinion, is the most critical because this is where, you're going to see that jump from thinking to doing. Adhering to extremist ideology is one thing, but when you start thinking about committing violence, you're on a path to transition from thinking to doing. And that is very, very dangerous. And eventually there will be some sort of triggering event, which we see up here on the slide, that will prompt the desire to start planning a violent attack. Peyton Gendron, the Buffalo supermarket shooter, he talks a lot about the planning he did leading up to the attack, and he did extensive planning. But if there is planning, there will be violence unless there is an intervention. So I think that's an important point. Like if someone is planning, they will commit violence unless there is some sort of intervention. So the government, the FBI, the National Counterterrorism Center, and the Department of Homeland Security jointly put together this book, The Mobilization Indicators. And I believe this, and we'll put the link to it in the chat. And this is, I believe, the most recent version of the book. It's a good book. Like it's got a lot of really good information, but it is like a dense read. Like it is not like, this is not a novel here. It's like dense, dry material. But there's a lot of good information in it. It lists over 40 indicators that someone may be mobilizing to commit a violent act. And I also like that with each indicator, they pair it with who was the likely observer of that indicator. So the indicator types, they're financial, which could be like moving or acquiring money or resources to prepare for and conduct violence. It could be ideology, developing or communicating the mentality or justification that could lead to the commission of a violent act. That's important too, because they're justifying it in their head, like this violence is needed because, or if I do this, it's not so bad because. The intent, which is developing or communicating goals or plans to commit a violent act. Relationship, which is interacting with others, including family or other violent extremists. So that relationship could be like two sides of a coin. Like one could be like connecting more with other extremists or other people who want to commit violence. But the other relationship could be like maybe they're saying goodbye to family members. Maybe they're giving away their belongings, things like that. Tactics, acquiring or developing skills, knowledge, or materials to engage in violent extremist activities. And then travel, which is transiting within the United States or abroad to prepare for and conduct violence. And Peyton Gendron, he traveled to that supermarket before he committed that violent act to plan out things. That was part of his plan. And then the observers are, for example, family members and peers who have direct in-person relationships with the individuals, but this could also be like neighbors or casual acquaintances, things like that. Social media users who passively observe the individual online, and who may have a direct relationship with the individual online. I will give you an example of being an observer. My company, Pandora's Intelligence, we do intelligence work. I spend a lot of time looking at these extremist groups online, and I came across a posting that was threatening to bomb an African American history museum in Detroit. And so, of course, like I immediately notified the FBI and the Detroit police. So that was an example of me being a social media observer. And the FBI did follow up, so I'm glad that they took it seriously. Another example of an observer could be a community authority figure, such as correctional officers, government regulators, religious leaders, passersby, teachers, work supervisors, colleagues. And then you have your commercial sector professionals, which could be company or store employees, travel professionals, things like that. And then finally, your financial sector representatives, which is employees of banking or investment entities. So observers always have the opportunity to intervene if they observe these indicators. And I think a lot of times we feel like, oh, well, this couldn't actually happen. But if you do observe some of these indicators, you should do something about it and you should act upon it. All right, so a couple charts just to show you some stats. These are terrorist attacks, plots, and fatalities. The fatalities, the big spikes, one is Oklahoma City, and then the second one is 9/11. But I think it's important to note that on this chart, most of the plots, attacks, and fatalities, with the exception of those, or the exception of 9/11, most of them are domestic terrorist and driven by domestic terrorism. These are domestic terrorist incidents, and the bigger the dot, the more incidents there have been. And then finally, we have domestic terrorism related incidents by category. So you can see the largest category is racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists. And I would say the majority of that is white supremacists and neo-Nazis, anti-Semitism. Not all of it, but the majority of it, yes. So how hate threatens democracy? So hate will threaten democracy if it is left unchecked. Democracy is dependent on citizens being active members of our government. And if people don't feel included or they don't feel safe enough to participate, then we don't have a democracy anymore, right? Like going back to slide 6, like democracy is dependent on people participating. And if people don't want to participate because they don't feel safe, then we don't have a democracy anymore. Particularly over the past few years, we've seen, and this is to the second picture here, we've seen a significant uptick in threats against elected officials, against candidates for office, other officials in public office, and against journalists. So in my time at the Capitol Police, and I was there from 2020 to 2023, in 2021, there were almost 10,000 threats against members of Congress, and on both sides of the aisle too. In 2022, there was a little over 7,500. In 2023, there was about 8,000 threats against members of Congress. So a huge volume of threats. And actually the bulk of my work at the Capitol Police was dealing with threats against members of Congress. You also have someone who is on the far right. He calls himself the Secretary of Retribution. I'm not going to name him here, but he has a hit list. In full disclosure, I am on that hit list, not once, but twice. So he has a hit list that is for people who, you know, are political enemies, who are journalists. There's a lot of journalists on that list. And those sorts of things like are created to intimidate into silence. And that, you know, that threatens our democracy. And, you know, it divides us. And when we're divided, we're weak. Because all of this sows discord and division. And when we're divided, we're weak. And our foreign adversaries know that. And they help to promote our divisions and sow that discord with disinformation. So those all together threaten our democracy. So let's talk about what we can do about it. We're coming up to the last couple slides here. So for now that we know what the what's and the whys of white supremacy, let's talk about what we can do about it. So first and foremost, I strongly believe in the power of education. Like, hate starts at home and it's reinforced at school. So to make long-term change for the benefit of the United States, children need to learn and understand that hate is wrong. And it is both as simple and as difficult as that. When efforts to educate children on the discrimination non-whites, non-Christians, and others have faced throughout the history of the United States, parents, teachers, and politicians are met with fierce opposition. And that opposition is denying children the opportunity to empathize with the adversity and struggles others have faced. This is not a woke takeover of education, as the Heritage Foundation has said. This is basic humanity. And barring children the right to know and understand different perspectives, it is disallowing children the possibility of healing the wrongs of the past and of preventing them in the future. The fact that so many feel threatened by a curriculum that tells a story of injustice demonstrates just how deeply ingrained that injustice is in our society. Such a curriculum does not divide, it creates the opportunity to bring Americans closer together. And then before I get into what other countries are doing to address this issue, I do want to talk a little bit about what we do here in the United States. So our programs in the United States are largely, and they were created and they largely focus on homegrown terrorists. So people who adhere to foreign terrorist organization ideology. But those models are good models and they could be used in domestic terrorism context as well. And you know, when Oklahoma City bombing happened, right after that, there was a huge focus on behalf of the government to focus on domestic terrorist groups. And they did focus quite a bit on it for, you know, a few years, but then 9/11 happened and that focus shifted away. And really, they haven't received much attention at all, probably until January 6th. And still, I don't think they get as much attention as they need. But within the United States, the Department of Homeland Security hosts the Center for Prevention Programs and Partnerships, which seeks to prevent acts of targeted violence and terrorism by working with the whole of society to establish and expand local prevention frameworks. The program outlines 5 core lines of effort that include coordinating and sharing resources by setting up personnel in the field, strategic engagement with a variety of stakeholders, helping to guide local prevention policies, offering grants to aid in prevention efforts, and promoting education and information sharing. So the program's a good one. It is a good one, but it hasn't been widely enacted. And DHS right now is so politicized. Like, and I came from DHS and I worked for immigration. So like, talk about political, but it's so politicized. It's really hard for them to implement any like broad, effective program to fight domestic terrorism. But there are some examples that are used overseas. So I'm going to start with the UK, even though they're last on the slide. But UK Prevent has done a much better job at implementing a similar program. Like the Center for Prevention Programs and Partnership, UK Prevent seeks to intervene in the prevention of radicalization before it leads to terrorist violence. It differs from the US's program a little in that UK Prevent focuses on leveraging the police because it's based on the belief that police would be the first ones to encounter someone who's going down this radicalization path. Even if it isn't, like disrupting a big like terrorist plan, maybe it's like petty crimes, things like that. They believe that police would be the first ones to recognize those signs. So UK Prevent has a goal of preventing vulnerable people being drawn into criminal behavior, and police make that referral to the Prevent program. And part of the program focuses specifically on terrorism through its Counterterrorism Advisory Network, CTAN. And CTAN is like Center for Prevention Programs and Partnerships that DHS has here in the United States, in that it provides community outreach, guidance in the development of prevention policies and other resources. But there's another model too, and I think Exit Deutschland is really interesting because it focuses on people who've already been radicalized. So in Germany and Sweden, there's a program called Exit Deutschland, even though it's in Sweden as well. It's designed to help stop the progression on that pathway to violence by giving extremists a way out. The goal is to have the radicalized individual get a place where they engage in critical reflection, reassess the ideology they were following, and challenge the old ideology. And so to achieve this, they provide education to families, to schools, to first responders, to communities. They work with radicalized individuals to help alleviate anxieties they may have about departing from a certain ideology or exiting that extremist groups that they're a part of. And they show them opportunities available to change and have fulfillment in their lives without the need for extremism. So really, really interesting program. And then let's talk about the future, and then we can wrap things up and start taking your questions. So looking to the future and like, what can you do? Support your educators and support curriculum that teaches tolerance and inclusion. Like I said in the previous slide, I really think education is key here. And advocate for that. Be an advocate. Advocate for the rights of others. Run for office, like I said. Running for office is not easy. I've done it. I lost, but I'm glad I had the experience. And I think even if you do lose, you're a voice in that conversation and you're raising concerns that other people aren't necessarily talking about or don't have a platform to talk about. And we do need really good people in office because we have a lot of really bad people in office right now. And hate has spread because extremists have been courted by politicians at all levels of government. These extremist groups and extremist ideology always exist. There's always a fringe element of society. But what we have seen over the past few years is that politicians take these extremists and they court them as a legitimate voting bloc, and they really like bring them in the fold. And when they do that, they give them a platform to spread their hate, and they make their hate mainstream. And then it becomes okay to hate. And I would challenge your elected officials too, like, don't threaten them, but do challenge them when they say something that is wrong. Like, you have a right to like call them to task for it. So those would be my recommendations. If you guys have other recommendations, I'd love to hear them as well. But I think we can turn it over now for some questions.
Okay, coming back online. Can you hear me?
Yes.
And can you see me?
Yes.
You can see me. Okay, wonderful. Julie, could you please stop sharing your presentation?
Yes.
Okay. Excuse me. So my name is Randy Wilding. I am the Chief Operating Officer for the Doxy Bracey Center for Human Reconciliation. We're talking about, excuse me, just a second. I'll take a sip too. Though Julie definitely earned it because she's been talking for an hour and 10 minutes and has covered what I would only describe as a tome of expert level information. I am and not in a bad way, I'm overwhelmed. I know that, and I sometimes I feel like I'm even though the nature of the center is for human reconciliation, sometimes when we have these very detailed conversations, I get overwhelmed with the amount of information. And I think also when you're specifically talking about planning and you're talking about, that no, it isn't, you don't just say like, hey, I know we just met. Are you interested in committing a terrorist, you know, uh, crime? It's a process. It's a long game. And I think it's for me, it's uh, really recognizing that this is a very complex, and although it's based in human needs and wants, it is very sophisticated in the way that it is rolled out and how it is sold to those that are vulnerable, the targets for this type of radicalization. So our friends online have not disappointed in their questions. Very, very candidly, we could go until probably 10 o'clock. We're not going to, because we all have responsibilities. So I'm going to do my best to highlight the questions that are, I think the ones that you should answer all of them, but we were limited in time, not limited in passion or enthusiasm. So the first question, I'm going to start with mine because I'm asking the questions and I really want to know the answer to this one. What is for someone who you are just having an initial conversation with, and you're telling them about how you were on social media and you saw this specific thing that was happening, that referenced the African History Museum in Detroit, and that there was a threat. Like, what is there? Let's say a layperson who doesn't have your experience. What are some of the reactions that they have when they hear what you're doing? And in that, have you ever experienced immediate pushback?
Yeah, I mean, I think, this is a tough topic and it makes people uncomfortable, especially, it makes people uncomfortable. So like when people hear like what I do for work, and I will be challenged from time to time, especially on social media with some of like the far right groups and individuals, and really trying to challenge, like, because I will call them out. I will call them out, and say, you know what, like, for example, today, if you check my Twitter, there was a post about denaturalizing people. I set up the denaturalization unit and it was very specific, but the context that it was being used by this political person was like very great replacement type things. And like wanting to have an immigration system that is both welcoming and has integrity is much, much different than saying, I don't want immigrants coming because they're going to eat my pets or whatever it may be. And so like challenging them, and I do get pushback, but like I think it's important to be secure in knowing that what you're doing is the right thing and speaking out is the right thing and not being intimidated. And it can be intimidating. I do have 2 young daughters and I'm talking about, heavy stuff, and I'm challenging people who can be violent. And I have gotten threats. I've gotten many threats. But I also know that me speaking, if I didn't speak out, like who else is going to speak out? Like going back to that quote, like, and you can't be dependent on other people speaking out. But also when you speak out, like then that gives other people like, oh, well, she could do something about it. Maybe I can do something about it too. Because if you are upset, and I would say this when I was running for office too, like if you see something in your community that you're upset about, like if you start to do something about it, I can guarantee you there are other people who feel the same way and are going to want to join you. And so like you start that snowball, but sometimes it starts with just speaking out.
Thank you so much, Julie. So really quick, I think this is just a clarification from the beginning of your presentation with regards to the KKK. And we've got, again, limited time. We have people coming in from all around the world. So when we're, and as you mentioned in your presentation, this is not unique to the US. Unfortunately, it is far larger. A matter of fact, actually, when Paul said that I was in Florida, I am not in Florida. I'm actually in Hawaii. And then while you were talking, out of morbid curiosity, I looked up, oh, well, you know, surely there aren't any hate groups in Hawaii. Wrong about that. There are 9. And they're all over. So, and there are ones that are on the continent or the mainland as well. So it's not unique. And that hate has spread and will continue to, unless we start standing up and taking your advice and speaking out, call it out when we see it. The question about the KKK, I think that there might have been a mention of who was responsible for what, or when the violence started. I don't believe that there's any debate in when lynchings were attributed to the KKK, that it wasn't a coincidence, or it wasn't unaffiliated. So that was just one of the comments in the chat. Okay. You touched on this, and we've talked about this from the chat and the Q&A. How can we protect our young children from being recruited?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think I will say generally, like having a loving, supporting home goes a long ways, because I think those who are most vulnerable to being recruited or becoming an extremist are people who don't have a great home life or don't have a good support system in place, and they're looking for that support and that attention and that whether it be caring or camaraderie, like they're looking for that. And so if you have, children like that, that's where it really starts, is at home, and making sure that you support them. But then particularly as they get older and they become teenagers, teenagers are their own creatures. And so, but looking for, like, are they becoming detached? Who are they hanging out with? Looking at their social media. Who are they following? Who's following them? What are they talking about on social media? Also look at, their internet history, like what websites are they visiting? What apps do they have on their phone? Like there are certain apps like Telegram, for example, like there is nothing teenagers should be looking at on Telegram. Like those apps are used by extremist groups. And so, looking like, are they going to 4chan? Are they going, there's other social media platforms too, more of these fringe ones, but like, where are they going? Where are they hanging out? Where do they have profiles? And then have a conversation with them. Like, don't be afraid to have a conversation, not necessarily like an accusatory conversation, but like open that line of communication and have that conversation and let them know how dangerous it is.
Thank you. Okay, so this one is more towards your experience, work experience with law enforcement and Homeland Security. How do you reconcile that so many folks can draw the connection to white supremacy nationalist history of level authority granted to law enforcement and to the foundations of many immigration policies? How do you respond to those systems? How those systems aid Western white supremacy?
That's a good question. I'll take the immigration part first, and then I'll go into law enforcement, because I do think that they are different. I think with immigration, in full disclosure, I worked for U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. I also worked for Homeland Security Investigations as well, which is a division of ICE, the criminal investigative division of things. I will say that the majority of the people, and I was in Boston too, so maybe some of it is regional, but being that Boston is a relatively liberal place, that I didn't get the sense that my coworkers were racist. And I do think that they tried to administer the law fairly. And I know that's not universal, but I also worked on some pretty interesting cases. We had a lot of human rights violator cases up in Boston out of Rwanda and the Rwandan genocide. And so we were doing like a lot of good work. And so I think it's a little bit to say like, well, they only deport people. No, I don't think that's necessarily true. And certainly like your, old lady neighbor was not high priority for deportation. They were really focused on criminals and things like that. And I will say at USCIS, like the employees of USCIS are passionate about helping immigrants. Like it is their sole focus. Not everyone qualifies for an immigration benefit, but I will say like hands down, like they are very, very passionate about helping immigrants. And that doesn't mean that there isn't like the rogue immigration officer who's a jerk. Like I came across them too, like they exist out there. But as I would say that they are the exception rather than the rule. And I'll say this too, I was the USCIS representative on the transition team between Obama's presidency and Trump's presidency. And I was a civil servant, I wasn't a political appointee. So unless the work I'm doing is illegal, I'm going to do it. And it was really hard because, Trump had a lot of executive orders in his first 3 months of his presidency that took a hard line on immigration. And I felt good in the sense that I was in a position where I could see his, appointees who were looking at these crazy things. And I was in a position to be like, well, maybe if we do this instead. And so like trying to like sway them and influence them and having a say in what could be done. I was not involved in the separation of the children, the families. I think that was horrible and inhumane. And I hope that never, never, never happens again. But generally speaking, I will say at USCIS in particular, like they're very passionate about helping immigrants, and it is what they do. Law enforcement is a little bit more complex. Yeah, I think it really depends on, I think it comes down to training, really is what it comes down to. And making sure, like here in Arlington has a community police academy. It's a 9-week course where you go, you sit with the police officers. Every division comes and gives you a presentation, explains what they do. They really welcome community input. They really focus on community policing. Arlington has about 54 neighborhoods or so, or civic associations, and there's a police point of contact for every civic association. And they come and speak to our civic association at our civic association meetings all the time. So they have really fostered a really good relationship with the community. That's not the case everywhere. And I think not only that, you need to focus on implicit bias. Because I think there are a lot of people in a lot of different contexts, particularly in law enforcement, where they will not identify as being racist and they will think that they are not racist, but then they have these biases that interpret or influence the way they act or they behave or they treat one person versus another person, and raising that awareness. And it comes down to training. And not every jurisdiction is willing to do that and put in that work. And so that's unfortunate. And I think we have a long ways to go there.
Julie, thank you. This connects directly to, and Stephanie, thank you so much for posting the implicit bias quiz or study. This is from Mark Batista, one of our folks who's joining on the webinar. Question for Julie: in the U.S., how does notifying the police when often police share some of these ideologies, how does it go? And I believe, unfortunately, directly connects to what you just said about implicit bias.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good question. I would probably report it to like more than one police department or police entity, like maybe report it at the local level. But if you have concerns that it's not going to get the attention that it needs, then report it to, do you have like an Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties within your state? Is it something that would rise to the level of the FBI? Those sorts of things. Like if you have those concerns, and I recognize they are very real concerns in some places, then report it to more than one entity. And that also like potentially holds them accountable too, because if that other entity says, or like, do they have an Office of Inspector General too? That's another good avenue. And because I think, if you can hold them accountable and make it visible, then you're more likely to have more luck with whatever you're trying to report.
Thank you. This one is specific from Dr. Deborah Myers. Is it true that the FBI eliminated their program to mitigate racially motivated extremist violence?
That I don't know. I know they have a domestic terrorism unit. I don't know, what it consists of or what they're focusing on. When I was at the Capitol Police and we did work with the FBI, we didn't include or eliminate any specific ideology. It was all looking at the threats, regardless of, what the ideology is.
Okay, thank you. This is a good, I think, we touched on election and you talked about your role in the transition between the Obama and Trump terms. This is from Bill Shears in the Q&A. Is there credible evidence that interactions between foreign racial hate groups and domestic groups in America are increasing or decreasing this election cycle?
So, I don't know if they're increasing or decreasing, but I do think that it is. I think you're talking more about like disinformation and the role of foreign influence on the elections, maybe? Is that what the question is?
That's all that I have, but I believe I trust your interpretation of the question.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is. There was a really good report that came out. It was either late 2021 or early 2022. There's a classified version, which obviously I won't talk about, but there's an unclassified version as well that talked about disinformation and election interference. And I talk about it, actually, I don't talk about it. There was a chapter in my book that I ended up taking out at the end that talked about this. And specifically Russia, as I think we're all aware, Iran, Hezbollah, they had Venezuela to a certain degree. They had concerted efforts to plant information and to further divide us and to exploit our divisions. And it's interesting too, because, everyone thinks that Russia loves Trump. They don't love Trump. They just like him better, or they dislike him less than they disliked Biden, because they thought, Biden would because at the time they were likely thinking about invading Ukraine, and they knew Biden would push back heavily on that. And they didn't think that Trump would push back as much, or they thought that Trump would be so distracted with all the drama that he provides to the country that he wouldn't have time to concentrate on Russia. Iran was different. Iran wanted Biden elected and Trump not, because they wanted to preserve their nuclear agreement that they had. So it's interesting. Different countries have different reasons for it, and also different things that they're targeting in their disinformation.
Thank you. So, I really like this question. This is from Michelle Summon Fisher. Where can unbiased information be found, and how can we sort through all of the, I'll say, the misinformation or disinformation that's online?
That's such a good question. I think we have lost like our ability to think critically and as a country. And that worries me a lot, because when I see some of the things online and I'm like, how can someone believe that? Like, it's so blatantly false. But I think it's good to, a couple things. One, like, look at the source. Like, what is the source of the information? What are other things that they're talking about? What are they tweeting? What are they posting? Things like that. And I'll just do a little tangent here about like bots and trolls. So bots will automatically like post a response in response to certain keywords. That's like a machine doing that. A troll is like an actual person who is responding to things online. And going back to the previous question too, it's often done to try to further sow division. But to look at those accounts, so when you see something crazy and you're not sure, is this true or not true, like look at their whole account. If they're posting a bunch of things that are all like hot button topic things, that's probably not a real person. If they're also posting like, 50 different things in one hour, and they're posting 24 hours a day, probably not a real account. Like, look at those sorts of things. Try to find the original source of the information that they're looking for. Like, for example, this came up in the presidential debate about killing babies after they're born, aborting babies after they're born. If you look at like where that concept came from Virginia, and it was part of like a much longer thing. And it wasn't about killing babies or aborting babies after they're born, but it was like one sentence that was taken out of context and then exploited for division and for political purposes. And then question like what's being said. Like, is this true? Does this make sense? Like those sorts of basic things. Like, we're not asking those questions, and we really should be. Like, is this true? Like, look into it and like before you respond, because a lot of those things are posted because they want to get an emotional reaction, and you're not taking that breath to step back and say, wait a second, is this true? I don't think this is true. So just use your basic, like critical thinking skills. Also be wary of text that's posted as a picture, because the algorithms have a harder time reading what it says. So a lot of disinformation is posted as like text, but as a picture. So be wary of those two.
I got to tell you, that's very helpful to me, because a lot of the centers, and some of you may not know this, a lot of our efforts as far as outreach goes on social media, for better or worse, don't get approved or are, I'm going to say suppressed, but I will also say shadow, whether it's a troll or a bot, whatever it is, reported as not appropriate. So if it gives you any idea who's sometimes looking at our materials and saying like, no, we don't want you to reconcile human oppression. So those folks are the ones who are reporting the content, would probably report this webinar as being not valuable, but also being untruthful, because they know that will affect our reputation, our online reputation, and however that's gauged through social media. So thank you for that. Be wary of text posted as a picture. Okay, this question came in and we talked about it before before the webinar started. What about women and girls? Are you seeing any emergence of women involvement in these groups? And if so, what are their roles? Thank you, Michelle, for that question.
Yes, thank you. I just was saying, I just finished the book, Sisters in Hate, which is right behind me, that talks about that very issue. And they profile some women who have joined extremist groups. So the groups do really target men more than women. But I think, the women who are interested in these groups, and almost all of these groups have very like specific images of what like a family should be, and like what a role for a man should be, what a role for a woman should be. And so I think some of the attraction for some women is feeling like they have a role and that they know what their role is, and it's very scripted for them. And that there's someone, because that role too is the subservient female, but the very like masculine male who like cares for the family, takes care of the family. And so that's very attractive to a lot of women. I don't think it always works out that way, but at least that's like the image the image that's being sold to them. And then I think also feeling like they're part of something that's powerful is also very enticing for a lot of women to join. But some of these groups, like Blood Tribe, for example, like they're not admitting women at all. But that doesn't mean that women aren't going to be on like the fringes of that. Like they're going to be married to or dating, one of the guys who are in these groups.
Thank you, Julie. So the question, in all of the discussion about book banning, my mind now is programmed to think about, all of the anti-racist library of old and new books that have been recently banned and targeted for one reason or the other, whether removed by the school board, the local school board, or from a state directive. The question is actually, are the books that I'll call them hate books or doctrine or guides to, are those books banned that you know of?
I think in some places they are, but like I don't think you can buy it on Amazon. But they are very readily available. They do come up on a Google search. There are private publishing companies that will sell them to you that you can buy directly from them, or you can just download them for free on social media. So yeah, I do think they are banned in some locations, but they are readily available.
Thank you. I want to say fortunately and unfortunately, it's a really hard one. Like, do you want to do a close reading of Siege to be able to understand the psychology and the motivation behind this this growth or this development, moving someone from grievance to terror, and understand that process, but at the same time is making those making those materials available also a risk for them just being out there.
Yeah, and I think that's, with a lot of the things you get away, like what is the risk for violence versus what are the First Amendment protections? And for someone like you or me who are reading these things, like we're just like bored and like I want to correct the grammar in it, like, things like that. But like there are other people who are going to read that and be like their mind blown, like it's like so inspirational for them. And so it really depends on like the context of or the mindset of the person going into reading it.
Thank you. Yeah, gosh, I would like to say that I wouldn't do that, but I'd probably like, why is there not a semicolon? Sorry, a little humor to lighten the air. So there are a couple questions in here that are so like you would understand what they mean, but I'm not totally sure what they mean. So I'm going to ask one that I think I understand. How does incel factor into these groups? Is there any overlap?
Oh, that's a good question. Incels, so for people who don't know, they strongly hate women. And incel stands for involuntary celibacy. So these are men who believe that women don't like them, they can't form any relationships, they can't have sexual relations with women because women reject them. And that leads to like hate and violence towards women. And so, yeah, there is some overlap. I almost think like the Proud Boys are like incels light. I don't think that they would say that like women don't like them. I don't think they would identify that way, but they certainly have that element of misogyny that incels also share. And, I think a lot of these white supremacist groups, because they're hypermasculine, they are in a similar vein as incels too. I also think that they wouldn't say that they have trouble finding women or things like that. But yeah, incels definitely have blossomed over the past few years or grown. And it's dangerous. It's definitely a dangerous ideology. Very, very hateful. If you ever go into their like chat rooms or what they're talking about online, very, very hateful towards women.
Thank you. Okay. I'm not going to get overwhelmed by the questions, but I'm overwhelmed a little bit by this one. With the transition of moving from larger national groups to smaller locally controlled groups, do we really know how many groups like this are out there or how they operate? And the reason why that takes me back is basically like you can, like you were saying, KKK has brand recognition. Like that's, for them, that's fantastic. But if you decentralize the hate and you make it more boutique or a la carte, then what? How do you quantify the way that Southern Poverty Law Center builds their hate map?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think it depends on the group. Like Proud Boys, for example, they're very, how many they have because they have a Telegram page that specifically lists all their things. So it makes it really easy for someone like me to figure out how many Proud Boy chapters there are. But other groups like active clubs, things like that, it could be harder. I think it's not quite as hard as people may think because almost all of them are online. It's just knowing like where to look and to how to find them. So in that sense, you can figure out what they're doing, what they're up to, unless they're a lone wolf. Like if someone's participating and considers themselves a member of a certain extremist group, whatever that extremist group is, those groups are communicating with each other. And a lot of these groups, white supremacist groups in particular, they're communicating online. So there are ways to figure out like what they're doing and how many groups there are. Membership is harder, like how many members they have. That's definitely harder to figure out. In those instances, at least from like a law enforcement perspective, we would work with informants to see like, well, how many people are in this chapter? How many people are in that chapter to come up with like an estimate of how many people are in the group. But that's more challenging than figuring out how many groups there are or what those groups are up to.
Thank you, Julie. Okay, we're gonna go back to, I can't believe it's already, we've got 15 more minutes, but I know we're not gonna get to all these questions. I would like to apologize that we're not gonna be able to get to all of them. All of them are fantastic. And I think everyone who's listening and will listen in the future to those that gave us their questions in advance and also live on during the event. How does CRT mitigate the hate that can be reinforced in schools? And we can approach the question differently if that's helpful.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. Like, I think, to be honest, like, let's not call it CRT because that's such a politically charged term now. Like, people assume they know what it is, but they really don't. They really have no clue. But if we just say, hey, we should teach American history and teach it from different perspectives that people may have of our history. Like, I think that's more palatable to people. And like, that's a way to talk about different people's experiences, their histories that may be different than, the history that has been traditionally taught, and letting people, kids should know that, and kids should have an awareness of, other people's perspectives. And, here in Arlington is a pretty liberal place. Like, my children's school, and I picked this area to live in because it's a really diverse area, and I want my children to grow up and know different perspectives and different cultures and things like that. There's like 56 different languages spoken amongst the children in the schools. And so they're exposed to a variety of different perspectives. But not everyone has that. And so they have to have it taught in the schools. And so I would really advocate it in the sense that, like, reframe the way we talk about that topic, CRT, so it is more accessible and less, you'll get a less like emotional reaction. We shouldn't have an emotional reaction to it to begin with because it's not a bad thing. But because it has become like hijacked from, on the right, like, oh, well, let's talk about it differently. Because if you said to someone, hey, like, Black people had a different experience than white people, in the 1800s, like, people would be like, oh, okay, yeah, I guess they did. And then go from there, right? But if you're saying, well, we're going to teach critical race theory, like, people are like, no, we can't do that. Like, so just, I think just reframe the way we talk about it, but I think it is very, very important to teach.
Thank you. And noting that it is a collegiate academic perspective by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, and that it exists almost exclusively in its true form in academia. Okay, I like this one. And please never apologize when you're asking a question. Don't say I did. This may be a stupid question. There are no simple questions. There are no stupid questions. With so much evidence, and Janet's referring to the charts and graphs, and like, here's real intel. Like, here we have data that we can touch and present. Why is it so hard in many of these instances to prosecute?
To prosecute? Well, I thought that question was going to go in a different direction when you started asking it. To prosecute, I think some of it has to do with like what the laws are. And like, there's this presumption of freedom of speech. And of course, like, that is very, very important. But freedom of speech is not absolute, and it shouldn't be absolute, because if you are threatening violence, if you are inciting violence, things like that, then you've overstepped the line. And law enforcement, particularly at the federal level, has been very hesitant to prosecute words like fighting words, threatening words, things like that. And with this domestic terrorism too, like, we don't have strong laws. There was a domestic terrorism bill in 2021, I believe. Only one Republican voted for it, Adam Kinzinger. And the reasoning for not supporting the bill was that they said, well, law enforcement already has laws that they can use to prosecute, but they're really not being used to prosecute domestic terrorism. And so I think carving that out, at least at the federal level, would be really helpful. And then at the state and local level, it might be even harder, because if there are no laws to prosecute different types of domestic terrorism, then it's going to be hard it's going to be hard to you're not going to be able to prosecute it. And also, I mean, like, we have to have good definitions too, right? Like, gathering with your guy friends in the backyard to fight, like, that's not illegal, right? That's not illegal, even though we know that they're sharing an ideology that is quite violent. But until they commit violence, they still have the right to talk about and do and say whatever they want to say. And so that's where I think, like, we don't have good guidelines as a country at the local, state, and federal level that define, you know, what is illegal, what is not illegal. And then sometimes it's a hard pill for us to swallow, that some of the things that people say and do, whether it be online or in person, are protected. That's protected language. Like, you know, the Patriot Front coming to the Capitol and marching, and they're holding their white supremacists. Like, that's so offensive to this country and to the people of this country. But constitutionally, they're allowed to do it. And so they're granted the permit and they can do it. And they can do it. And they're not doing anything illegal. They're just marching, and freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, and it's protected.
Is the planning piece, going back to your presentation, so going from grievance to terror, is the planning piece protected? Like, the guys get together in their backyard and they're fighting and drinking beer or whatever. If they start to plan something, is that the threshold?
It could be, depending
Okay.
on what they're planning. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
And we see, I mean, you see
I wanna
terrorist
understand how
plots.
Sorry.
Yeah, you see terrorist plots all the time being disrupted, and those people are charged. So yeah, the planning could definitely be considered illegal, depending on what laws they're applying to the situation.
Thank you. We got 8 more minutes. I'm going to try and knock out as many as we can. You talked about Exit Deutschland and UK Prevent. Is there a way, an effective way to deprogram? This is from Kylie McWilliams, to deprogram people from extremist beliefs.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a psychologist, but I think Exit Deutschland has had some success, and that's like an element of Exit Deutschland, is to like deprogram people and to replace. Is if we think of it like people have a hole in themselves, and that's what attracts them, and they're using that extremist ideology to fulfill that hole. And I think Exit Deutschland does that, like, okay, well, let's take that extremist ideology out and fill that hole with something that's productive and that's something that's positive. So I think it can be done. We don't have a program like that, or like a national program like that here in the United States, but I think it would be helpful. Do I think the United States will ever do something like that? No. Part of it is cultural, like the US is very individualistic. And so that makes it more challenging to have some sort of widespread program like that.
Well, I just took note because, I mean, if anybody's listening that has a fantastic business idea to deprogram white supremacy, go for it, by all means. Okay. How do you see the use of AI technology in white supremacy radicalization or other forms of radicalization?
Oh, that's a good question too. I think the way we're seeing it most often now is used with disinformation and like promoting disinformation. Because if you look at like a lot of the memes white supremacist groups use, a lot of them originate outside the United States. And they are used to, you know, further sow division. But those sorts of, you see AI being used a lot in that context, in like, in promoting extremist ideology, things like that. And trying to think what else, like, yeah, I mean, I think it would be mostly to like further promote like extremist ideology and taking certain things and being able to exploit it further, and using AI to do that, like taking a legitimate picture and changing it to be more extremist. Like we've seen uses of that, for example.
Okay, thank you. That's I didn't think of that, but that's a fantastic answer, and I believe that answers Carol's question. Oh, so many questions. So I think we have time maybe for two more. Where does the false equivalency of danger of far left and far right?
That's a good question. So I think the far right compared to the far left is much more organized. The groups have structures, they have ideologies, they have like they're very organized. On the right, on the left, generally, if you think like Antifa is more like an umbrella ideology, but it's not organized. There's no leader, things like that. Some like left-leaning groups are like they are, but they're much smaller. I think of some, particularly in the UK, like some extreme animal rights activist groups. They have done violent things and they have leadership. But generally in this country, the far left is not particularly organized, but the far right is very well organized. And they are very like strong, like groups. Even if they're small groups, they're like strongly formed groups.
I want to, before I bring Paul back in, I wanted to share just a brief what I am now realizing. Now I'm 47, coming back, growing up in Washington, D.C., and very similar to the experience that you wanted to have for your daughters in a multicultural, multi-ethnic area that had access to not just one religion or one language or one type of people, perceived race or otherwise, that want to belong, that I had when I was younger and did not get touched by the radicalization. I now, in retrospect, I'm very thankful of that I didn't get into what I believe we've been talking about for the last 2 hours. And that I can understand how easy it is to slip into, we're talking about, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the basic needs not being met. And so those people who aren't having their needs met by their close family, by their friends, they become extremely easy targets for this radicalization. And instead of, I couldn't have gone to TikTok, but now it's ubiquitous. Access to the personal devices wasn't just a newspaper. Now it's, now it's everywhere. So I just want to recognize that to try and see the opportunity, I would love to, think about how we could create something that looks like a program or deprogramming. But unfortunately, what I have to do now is end our time together, which I have really enjoyed. I want to bring back Paul to close us out, Paul Bracey. And I just want to say, Paul, if you could come back on camera and audio. I just want to say how amazing this has been. This time with you has been. I've been looking forward to it for a very long time. We planned this a while. If for those of you that don't have a copy of Julie's book, Domestic Darkness, please consider getting it, either purchasing it from a Black-owned bookstore, where you spend money, how you spend money, has power, or borrowing it from your library, who I assure you the librarians are doing their very, very best to make sure all of the books are available, and you can borrow a copy of it. Julie, thank you, and I'll turn it over to Paul to close us
Thank
out.
you.
Thank you, Randy. And thank you, Julie, for a very informative presentation. And hopefully it was motivating for the people who attended this evening. I do want to acknowledge a couple of our team members. Some of you met Stephanie through the chat room. Stephanie Dirkrill does a lot of the background work, as you notice, what she provided on the chat. And Joanne Zidek, who is our events coordinator, brings all of this together and keeps us on track. So I want to thank them both for their commitment and for their work with us this evening. And Julie, again, I want to thank you. And I want to put out a reminder to people that are attending tonight that on October 16th, we have another webinar, which is actually a continuation of this one by David Pepper, who is a lawyer, writer, political activist, and former elected official, and an adjunct professor. And his talk will focus on saving democracy in the short and long term. And that's something that Juliet picked up on, but David will spend a lot more time on that. So please join us for that session, and also consider donating to us so we continue to make this free. Have a good evening, and thank you for attending. Thank you again, Julie. Good night.
Thank you.